because fossil fuels have been turned into some sort of, like a religion, like we don't touch, I don't know, I'm Jewish, we don't touch pork or something, as if it's, something that there's a religious reason not to do something and not a practical approach anymore. And so I think that sub-Saharan Africa is the most glaring example where your alternative is either burning, dung and wood and biomass with all its dangers and all its emissions and all its pollution, or fossil fuels. And still, our international multilateral Western institutions, they just can't, think of funding, fossil fuels.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Heather Exner-Pro, the Director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment. Energy is always a hot topic, but geopolitical tensions, AI demand, climate policy, and tariff woes have all propelled it to the top of political priorities. There's one aspect of energy that barely attracts any attention these days, and that's energy poverty. While development used to dominate discussions about emerging economies, in the past 10 years, it seems to have fallen off the radar, replaced by concerns about climate change and advocacy for renewable energy. One region in particular has been hit hard by this trend, sub-Saharan Africa, where access to electricity has actually declined. To help us put this issue back on the agenda, I'm delighted to have Professor Brenda Shaffer join me today. Brenda is an international energy and foreign policy specialist, a faculty member at the US Naval Postgraduate School, and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center in Washington, D.C. She's also the author of a paper we'll be releasing this month entitled Disempowering Africa, How the West's Energy Policies Fuel Poverty in the Continent. Brenda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, and I was telling you, I'm so delighted that we're finally having more of a discussion, robust discussion, and thanks for your efforts on energy poverty. Because where I came intellectually and academically and professionally was from that, that development and that energy poverty space. And my early work in Canada was really about Indigenous and Northern and Arctic energy access, and it kind of evolved into the geopolitics of it. And so I have also been struck by the fact that really for the past 10 or 20 years, what the issue was so preeminent in the 80s and 90s has been almost totally displaced by climate change. So that's my first, question for you. How did you see this evolution? When do you think poverty became relegated behind climate change as a global policy priority?
Right. So first thing, I think what was missing was energy security. So suddenly energy policy became a subset of climate policy, and energy security, was disappeared. There's like plenty of energy, and we had a lot of myths that were propagated that somehow renewable energy doesn't have geopolitical issues, or does, and also another myth that renewable energy prices aren't volatile. So how do we solve the price issues, affordability, if we just spread renewable energy? And a lot of people bought into this, even though it's not justified, in any way by the facts. But you had senior policy political leaders in the United States, Europe, Canada, saying that renewable energy solves all geopolitical energy policies and problems and all affordability problems, and people bought into this. And with the energy poverty issue, I would say predominantly towards the end, like the end of the 2018, 2019, 2020, suddenly you see the major multilateral institutions in the West give priority to emissions reduction over not only over energy security but over poverty reduction. So, the World Bank from the end of the last decade gives up all funding for fossil fuels, electricity production from fossil fuels. The G7, with a lot of enthusiasm from Canada, adopts, no funding for fossil fuels abroad. And the International Energy Agency in 2021 comes out with its net zero, and we have to stop all investments in fossil fuels. And this affects the West in the sense that we had underinvestment in fossil fuels. So you have, inflation, recession in the West. But these policies hit hardest the world's poorest. So poor people in high income and middle income countries, but especially the world's poorest, especially in Africa, where, as you pointed out in your introduction, we've had a backpedaling in electricity access. And up until now, maybe this year, it's the first time that you're seeing, with a review of these international institutions like the World Bank's policies, the International Energy's policies, that you're seeing any sort of awareness that these policies have really hurt the world's poorest.
Yeah, I totally agree. And UN Sustainable Development Goals were a lot more broad. They did have poverty reduction, access to energy, for example, in the goals, but it seems like everyone only focused on the one SDG, which was reducing emissions. But let's dig into that. I'm glad you're putting the focus on sub-Saharan Africa. And again, when I was coming up through school, there was a lot of effort, a lot of thought put into development. There was a lot of progress made. But now we've seen a real plateau. And I was really struck, there's a graph in your paper that shows, how energy access has improved or plateaued. It's gone much better in Asia, but your graph shows how basically it's plateaued for, over 10 years, where the number of Africans with access to energy has basically been stagnant. So can you unpack that? Tell us about energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. What stopped that progress? What energy sources they have to resort to? And how all that correlates to economic development also.
Right. So, first thing is that people have to understand that no matter what, people are going to consume energy, right? So you still have to cook your food, heat, purify water, often, scare away animals through having fires, right? So if you don't have electricity, or if you don't have liquid fuels, you're gonna burn, generally what, the most households in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have energy access, they burn biomass, they burn lump coal, they burn dung, wood, and this is the most polluting, the most carbon emissions, the highest threat to human health, and actually the largest impact on the environment, because you have to take down forests in order to get the wood and to burn to build the create the charcoal. And if anyone who's ever traveled in sub-Saharan Africa, and you've seen this, and you've seen, that pollution is not outdoors, it's not from factories, it's indoors. And the most vulnerable to this pollution are women and children that are, most of the time in the homes. So the International Energy Agency, World Bank, they acknowledge that this indoor pollution is, even for their climate agenda, is worse than fossil fuels. But still, because fossil fuels have been turned into some sort of, like a religion, like we don't touch, I don't know, I'm Jewish, we don't touch pork or stuff, as if it's, something that there's a religious reason not to do something, and not a practical approach anymore. And so I think that sub-Saharan Africa is the most glaring example where your alternative is either burning, dung and wood and biomass with all its dangers and all its emissions and all its pollution, or fossil fuels. And still, our international multilateral Western institutions prefer the results from the indoor pollution, because they just can't think of funding fossil fuels. And I think also they sort of glorify, these people can have off-grid solar, and so what does that mean? That means that, like, second-class world citizens, that actually the off-grid solar doesn't replace the indoor pollution, because you can't cook with most of the solar the solar power they have. It can maybe charge a lantern, so you have a few more hours of lighting at night. Charge a cell phone, which can help with business coordination and economic activity, but it doesn't give you power tools. It doesn't give you washing machines, and it doesn't give you clean cooking. And the idea that somehow that's considered energy access, that we've because people are so in love with renewable energy, I think is a big disservice to people in sub-Saharan Africa. And then also, I think the international institutions, they they don't, let's say the International Energy Agency recently released a very big report on, clean cooking in Africa, get a lot of money from the Norwegian Development Agency for this report, fly all over, fly to Kenya, present the report, have a nice, presentations. But yet they give every solution there except for the obvious solution, which is fossil fuels. Africa has had some of the biggest natural gas discoveries since the beginning of this century, and most of them have gone undeveloped simply because of the drying up of public finance and loans for fossil fuels. So what happened? The G7, they meet together, they feel really good. Wow, we don't support fossil fuels. It doesn't really impact their countries because the high income countries don't need loans or funding for energy development. But where it hurts is the world's poorest, especially in Africa. And doesn't seem that there's much awareness about that.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack there that I want to get into with the multilateral institutions and also with the financing. I just want to first point out, I think we've all seen the graph, our world in numbers of, we talk about energy transition, but clearly we're at energy addition mode. We've been in energy addition mode for, as long as there's been human civilization. And the number, I think people certainly in Canada don't appreciate that 1 billion people still use biomass, wood and dung, as a primary source of energy. And that the amount that humans use has been about even for the last 200 years. We have not displaced any use of biomass and dung for energy. We've only added oil, natural gas, nuclear, renewables on top of it. So we haven't even transitioned off of dung, let alone, fossil fuels like natural gas. But you alluded to the policies of the IEA, the World Bank, some other UN agencies, and you go through it in your paper. And one thing, you highlighted, and it struck me many times, that for many of these policies, it seems like the goal is to increase renewables, not to reduce emissions, which would be a separate goal, and not to increase energy access, but specifically monitoring and trying to just increase renewables. Can you, help me explain, or what you've seen, why you think renewables have become so centered in this discussion instead of emissions or energy?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in general, we could talk about why is there, there's sort of like a very limited set of options that have been presented as the way to deal with potential climate change, which makes us think that it's really not about climate change, but it's more about an anti-fossil fuels movement. I mean, I think, throughout the 20th century, there's, but especially after World War II, there's been, just sort of this anti-development trends, anti-fossil fuels actually sort of prevent class conflict in a way, because everyone can get prosperous. If you're in a society with high energy access, everyone can be prosperous, right? And so, I think there's a lot of, and especially after the fracking revolution in the United States, when basically, markets had become so much more liquid, prices had gone down, friendly countries like the United States, Canada, big energy producers, changing the geopolitical dynamics of energy trade. It seems that, much of the climate policy was more about how to stop fossil fuels, more than, about climate aversion. Like I said, the policies in place for Africa generate more carbon emissions than fossil fuel use would. But still, the international, the multilateral agencies are not willing to advocate development of fossil fuels in Africa or fossil fuel-based electricity.
Do you see, now I just want, before we move on to the financing, you alluded to, we just, drafted the new IEA paper that seems to be, changing their particular methodology to be a bit more realistic. We are seeing a bit of a green lash or a correction. Are you seeing that? Do you think there's been a noticeable correction in how we're treating this, or do you still think it's kind of on the same trend?
Well, first thing, in June of this year, the Energy Institute, which is also one of the more comprehensive calculators of or assessors of energy data. They published in their 2025 report. They published that fossil fuels today, not only are they still around, they actually deliver 87% of global energy. So this is in contrast with their assessment the year before, that it was 81.7. So the whole idea that so a couple of points here. One, they didn't put it in their in any of their press releases. They didn't put it in their executive summary. I mean, this is sort of like the kind of thing, hey, world, wake up. This is like a huge reassessment. And, any of the ideas of saying we're in an energy transition. I mean, I agree with you. I always thought it was kind of, a ridiculous idea. You don't have any replacement of today's renewables. They don't replace fossil fuels. Like you said, they add on to fossil fuels, but also the way we consume renewable energy is through electricity. Electricity needs a base load, and most of that base load is provided by fossil fuels, right? So they don't in any sense, replace fossil fuels. So so this idea that we were in an energy transition, it was, sort of some kind of campaign, but not based on reality. And then, by the way, when we first met last May in Banff at the Canadian Natural Gas Association's conference, we were discussing this even at a panel chaired by today's US Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright. Are we in an energy transition? And most people in the room would say yes, we are, but there's absolutely no data to back this up. So the Energy Institute publishes this their new assessments, 87% fossil fuels, which means, that this is the fuel, we use. And it's not in the executive summary. It's not in the press release. There's you would think that this is very important news. It's sort of like, let's say you're a researcher on cancer and you say there's a rise in cancer. That doesn't mean you're pro-cancer, but it means you're just giving the proper data to the public, right? But most of our multilateral institutions, they hide this data, or they at least keep it very, moderate, so that you can't really tell that actually we are not in an energy transition. Renewable energy is not, taking off. And there's a variety of reasons why today's renewable energy, it just can't deliver the goods. It's not energy dense enough. Like I said, it's dependent on a base load of fossil fuels. It makes electricity more expensive. Where you have a high degree of renewables, you actually have higher electricity prices, because instead of working very efficiently, let's say with all nuclear, all gas, or all coal, you're paying, for inefficient use of nuclear and gas as a base load, and then adding volatile renewables, and then you have to pay for the cost for always, keeping the grid stable. So telling Africans that they should not develop their own fossil fuels, which means, okay, where's the base load for this renewable? So they can basically only have very volatile renewables, which means they can't use power tools, they can't have refrigeration, which means they can't have modern medical services if you don't have refrigeration, which means it hurts investments coming into Africa, because if you're thinking about setting up a factory in Africa and you have to add the cost of your own electricity, or if you use the grid, you have to understand you're going to hurt your machinery all the time and have costs because of the shortages, the failures of electricity. You think I'll go somewhere else, and then. Also, in sort of the International Energy Agency, in their last report, they were saying, well, Africa should emulate China and Indonesia, and how they were able to go into clean cooking, and they were able to get off of dung and wood. But those countries, how did they do it? They did it through coal, right? Okay. But that they don't mention, in the report. So, so how can you emulate that route when actually we don't want to encourage Africa to use coal? It's not going to be funded. So what's the real answer?
Yeah, and when you don't have functioning, electricity grids, which you often don't in Africa, people are self-reliant. And one thing people often use is diesel generation. Why do I bring this up? Because it's about a year ago, I think it was Kenya, but honestly, I can't remember. One of the countries had to reduce their subsidies for diesel because it was just too expensive in the state budget. And it was presented in some international media as a great success, that, we're getting rid of diesel, we're not subsidizing these fossil fuels. What it meant in practice was that poor people who had no other reliable access to energy, who are just relying on their own diesel generation, now couldn't afford even that diesel generation to turn on their lights in the evening, or to do, again, to do cooking or to do laundry for a couple of hours a day. And I want to unpack this idea of fossil fuel subsidies, because when the rubber hits the road in your paper, what are we recommending? Is that there's a huge movement with multilaterals, with countries like Canada, to say we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels because fossil fuels are bad. And in practice, what that means is we have stopped subsidizing energy access. Because as you say, 87% of energy, if you're not subsidizing fossil fuels, you're not subsidizing most energy. And access to energy is a human right. So walk us through, this concept of fossil fuel subsidies, how multilateral agencies in the international community tried to pair it off, and why that lack of financing has had such detrimental effects in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. So I think we need to separate between consumption subsidies and loans and finance for development of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based electricity, because most places where you give consumption subsidies, whether it's through below market prices for diesel or LPG, and this distorts the markets, and in the end actually ends up helping the richest people, because the richest people, especially in countries where there's high corruption, they get a hold of this diesel, they get a hold of the LPG, and they either use it, sell it for mopeds in the urban cities, or they sort of retool them to use these fuels, or they distribute it and they add costs. So direct subsidies for consumption, I don't think is a good, in most cases, a good development tool. What we're talking about, and we're not even really necessarily talking about gifts or subsidies or something from the international community. I mean, what we've had in the past, from like around 2019, but especially with the G7 decision in 2021, is the richest countries in the world actively trying to dry up even investments for fossil fuels. So one of the main I think a guy maybe you've heard of, now Premier of Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. So, he had a business coalition that, trying to sign up almost every bank, every major company, insurance company in the world, that they would not, that they would align themselves to the Paris Agreement, they'd align their business to net zero, and they would stop, even loans, fundings, investment for fossil fuels. Again, this primarily hit Africa, where it's harder anyways to attract investments, and also because they had just had a string of gas discoveries, so they were very ripe, for ripe for investments, and those investments didn't come. So first thing, there was sort of the G7 encouraged, people like Mark Carney, John Kerry went all around the world, yelling at Wall Street and telling them not to invest in fossil fuels. That fueled inflation and recession in the West. But again, the hardest hit, the energy access, was to Africa. So we don't necessarily need subsidies. We need, and also we need like proper information, because if you look at the World Bank, IEA, is telling them in all their reports that we're in an energy transition. Africans are going to just have stranded assets with their oil and gas. They shouldn't develop it. And they should actually go into mining and mine critical materials for us. So which means, like, instead of developing an energy for their own markets, and then maybe this could create jobs, and maybe this could, they could manufacturing and improve the productivity of their agriculture. You could just mine, and sell us, these goods, which would mean a very small proportion of the people would benefit from this. And also, you could sell carbon credits. So for not doing, for not developing your energy, maybe you could just get a handout. Also not, just creating dependence on the West, creating reinforcing a handout culture. This is not what sub-Saharan Africa needs.
Yeah, I totally agree. And thanks for distinguishing subsidies and financing. And I think some of the institutions do distinguish, but often in the ENGO community, they categorize any financing. So for example, Export Development Canada is now restricted from providing financing again to maybe some African partners to invest in, for example, natural gas generation that they could use as important baseload for their grids and stabilize their grids. And that is, that they put it on a list every year of all these bad things you're doing by financing these developing nations to develop, again, stable electricity access. Tell me, in your work and in your travels, what you are hearing from African leaders, because it seems that doesn't always reach the ears of the West.
Right. Yeah. I think part of the problem is too many, that the African development institutions that are, they're funded, primarily by Western institutions, and so they've fallen in line also with these policies. You don't hear a lot of people from the development community or African leaders, say no to these policies. But many of them, you're just seeing by their actions. If the West isn't going to give, it's not going to finance or give loans for development of energy in Africa, then they'll get it from China. And so all we're basically doing is opening the door, to have even, more Chinese influence in Africa, which are already in a quite prominent position in most of Africa, but giving away the energy sectors, which we know that this is strategic. This is a way to have, a long-term influence. And it shows that, Chinese are thinking, they're thinking about the needs of the people of Africa, while the West is thinking about, feeling good at cocktail parties and saying that, well, we don't finance fossil fuels. We're very good. We're very good people. And so I think there's a geopolitical danger from ignoring this. And you also see countries that have fallen in line, take Sri Lanka, 100% accepted the net zero Paris agreement dictates, and got all the completely took out synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and just crashed their own economy, cast their food. They were self-sufficient in food. Suddenly they have to import food. They don't have revenues from export of rice and tea, and they they have mass riots and throw their government out, right? And we're going to see continued instability if people don't get access to electricity. Just kind of anecdotal. I remember traveling around with a friend in Tanzania, and he left his cell phone by a hydropower plant where he pays a fee and they charge his phone. We come back after some time in the nature, after 3 hours, and his phone is in fully charged. And he said, we in Africa would like real electricity. Use the term real electricity. What does he mean by real electricity? Reliable. You turn on a switch, you have it. You try to charge a cell phone 3 hours, it charges. Yeah. And by the way, and you see also that how also this, how is it that suddenly some other person is sort of like a contractor that's making money off of all of these, people with the, for their energy accesses as well from the hydropower plant. But yeah, people want real energy. It's essential. We talk a lot about digital divide, but the electricity divide in the world is probably much more, important.
Yeah. And this gets to kind of the last thing I want to discuss. I think one reason that we were able to slide, kind of the excess of this policy trend is because we were able to be complacent in the West about energy access. And I think, for example, the shale revolution really made energy cheap. We've had very reliable access. Most of us have grids of 99.99%, reliability. And so you could forget that not everyone has that same access. And you forget about the costs of having not access to real electricity, not having reliable access to energy, the horrible costs of that on human development, on human dignity, on potential of people. And we just didn't see it. And so this is, there's a line in your paper, and it says, it's time to flip the moral high ground. Tell me what that really resonates with me, because I think reducing poverty and providing energy access I think that has the moral high ground, but that hasn't been the discussion. What does that mean to you? How did we lose the moral high ground, and why do we need to get it back?
Right. Very important question. Um, I think that, there's like one set of climate policies, and it's kind of a funny thing, but it should be that renewable energy somehow will lower emissions, and this will change the climate trajectory. But it's not really accurate. One, as we discussed, we're not adopting massive amounts of renewable energy. That's not the trend. Two, we know, just that, anyone who deals with energy, that today's renewable energy cannot meet today's needs, let alone the future needs, and the increasing electricity needs. And you even see it, by the way. Look at the sort of shameless behavior of all the companies that joined, the Glasgow Coalition and all this, and signed up for net zero and dried up these investments. But the minute they understand their electricity needs from AI and other data centers, they completely drop out of all these organizations. They shift all the dialogue on, net zero. One by one, these companies leave. So it just didn't matter. And even the same thing, like you mentioned, the International Energy Agency. So they're about to come out now with a bit more reporting again, and more realistic scenarios. I think they should drop all the scenario. In fact, it would be just better to publish data instead of scenarios. I think it's very misleading. Just report the data. Why do if you want to have another report on scenarios? But let's say they're going back to more realistic scenarios. And but what about all these 5-6 years that people, the investments were dried up? They were telling people we don't need more investments in fossil fuels. Companies were listening to them. You had companies that slashed their investments in fossil fuels. You had Wall Street drying up the investments in fossil fuels. People over the world got hurt. And then it's like, oh, sorry, we changed our mind. And then you wonder, why do we have this trend of skepticism about international institutions, about media, about medical practices, right? People do not take responsibility at all for their mistakes, and they knew what they were doing. Everyone, of course, knew that wind and solar can, it's going to heat Canada. Really, you're gonna heat Canada with wind and solar, and people in Germany, they're the best. They invested everything in it, and public support, and look at they have not reduced emissions, they have not increased their energy security, and they're basically deindustrializing, right? So we see the reality of these policies. But again, I think, and I'm very happy about this podcast, but there's very few, I think, people have seen how indecent really it's been, what's happened to sub-Saharan Africa. And even if you look in the last International Energy Report, to kind of make it, beautify it a bit more, they put in the statistics of South Africa and North Africa to get, together in the reports on Africa. Well, completely different situation. South Africa has coal, North Africa has gas. And so that gives you a very, very different picture than what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, the only part of the world where energy access isn't growing, but it's actually, declining and backpedaling.
Yeah. Well, Brenda, I'm so delighted that you have not been afraid, to give the unvarnished truth for the last few years, and how important, that everyone is seeing that it is indecent. And you are shining a light on it. And I'm delighted that MLI can help you shine a light on this problem of energy poverty that we've been ignoring for several years. So thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for your paper. Thank you for your work. To our audience, thanks for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more people like Brenda onto these podcasts. And for MLI, I'm Heather Exner-Pro. Thank you for joining us today on Inside Policy Talk.